Hello.
Hola, friends.
Welcome back. That's a really great way to start off this episode. So I want to preface this episode with some trigger warnings. We are going to talk about the Jack the Ripper case. It's been on my wish list. It's another one on my wish list for a while. But there are going to be descriptions of murder, including gore, violence, domestic violence, substance abuse, those kind of topics. So if that is something that unsettles you or bothers you in any manner, and you know that that's not something you want to listen to, please feel free to see us next week or re-listen to a favorite episode. I get it. This isn't for everybody. But we'll get right on into it. Even most people who don't consider themselves to be true crime buffs know the name Jack the Ripper. His name appears in more than 100 books, films, and television shows, despite the fact that he committed heinous crimes and his true identity is unknown. A paper written by a college student named Aaron Thompson said, "This mythical version of Jack the Ripper continues to be the real-life example of a gothic monster created in the 19th century, as his story brought the social anxieties and dangerous unknowns surrounding East London together with the population's morbid curiosity about the dark side of humanity." And I think that that is a very perfect way to put that, and how this case has been catapulted into popular culture. Focusing the attention of the press and the public at large toward one of London's poorest and most crime-ridden quarters, whoever Jack the Ripper was, managed to expose the sordid underbelly of Victorian society and created awareness amongst the wealthier London citizens of the horrible social conditions that had been allowed to fester, primarily unchecked, right on the doorstep of London, the wealthiest square mile on Earth.
The Ripper case occurred over 125 years ago, so why does it still capture attention? It is generally believed that the Ripper only had 5 victims, and wasn't a particularly prolific murderer in comparison to those who come after him. His reign of terror only lasted about 12 weeks, so he wasn't at large for a particularly long time, yet there is very little doubt that he is the world's most famous serial killer. There are many factors that were combined to make this one of the most famous true crime stories of all history. The newspapers of the day gave a massive amount of coverage to the crimes and provided their readers with daily updates on the goings-on of the Whitechapel murders, resulting in Jack the Ripper cementing his place as a menacing media figure. Another factor is that the area in which the killings occurred was looked at as being a hotbed of vice and villainy, and was the breeding ground for social unrest, squalor, and disease. In the eyes of Victorian society, the Whitechapel murderer became the personification of all of the evils with which the East End of London was associated. There's also the name that the killer would become known as, Jack the Ripper. This name first appeared on a letter sent to the head of a London news agency at the end of September of 1888. This name, which may have been the invention of a journalist, had the effect of turning 5 sordid East End murders into an international phenomenon and catapulted, an unknown miscreant who is responsible for the crimes into the realm of a legend. The Whitechapel murders are probably the most studied crimes in history, and to this day, research is conducted around the world.
In the late 1800s, the East End of London was viewed by citizens with either compassion or contempt. This area was full of skilled immigrants, primarily Jews and Russians, who came to begin their new lives and start new businesses, but the district was plagued with squalor, violence, and crime. Prostitution was only illegal if the practice caused a public disturbance, and thousands of brothels and low-rent lodgings were readily available for those providing sexual services in the late 19th century. During this period, the death or murder of a working girl was rarely reported in the press or discussed within polite society. But the reality for these sex workers was that they were subjected to physical attacks, many of which resulted in death. English prostitute Emma Smith was beaten and raped with an object by 4 men, and she later died of peritonitis and is remembered as one of many unfortunate female victims killed by gangs who demanded money in exchange for protection. In August of 1888, a series of killings would stand out from the other violent crimes of the time as they were marked by sadistic butchery and suggested a more sociopathic and hateful than most other citizens could even comprehend. Jack the Ripper didn't simply snuff out the lives of 5 women. He mutilated and disemboweled women, and his crimes seemed to portray an abhorrence for the entire female gender.
Between April of 1888 and February of 1891, 11 women were murdered in the East End of London, and their names were included in a police file that was officially labeled the Whitechapel Murders. It is believed that only 5 of those women were killed by one man, who has passed through history as Jack the Ripper, called such from the signature of a taunting letter sent to the Central News Office in September of 1888. These 5 women are often referred to as the canonical, right?
Canonical.
What she said, 5 victims of Jack the Ripper, and were murdered over a 9-week period between Friday, August 31st and Friday, November 9th of 1888.
On August 31st, 1888, the horrifically mutilated body of a woman was found in a gateway in Bucks Row in Whitechapel. She was later identified as Mary Ann Nichols, known to her family and friends as Polly Nichols. She had separated from her husband and their 5 children in 1880, and from there she was on a downward spiral blighted by poverty and alcoholism. As August was beginning, she found her way to the East End of London, where she resided at 2 Spitalfields Common lodging houses. Wilmot's, situated at 18 Thrall Street, and the White House, located on Flower and Dean Street. It was 4 pence per night at these establishments, and on the night of August 30th, she didn't have that much money to her name and was denied a night's rest at Wilmot's. At the time, Mary Nichols was known as an unfortunate woman, who in those days were of there being no welfare to assist those who have fallen on hard times, may turn to casual prostitution in order to earn money for a bed to sleep in, a bit of food to eat, and the drink that fed her addiction. On that night, Mary was wearing a bonnet that none of the other lodgers had ever seen her in before, and with it being obvious that she had intended to resort to prostitution in order to earn the money for a room for the night. She felt this could be an irresistible asset to draw in a potential client or 2. As she was escorted from the premises by the deputy lodging housekeeper, Mary laughed at him as she stepped out into the dark of the early morning and said, "I'll soon get my DOS money. See what a jolly bonnet I have now."
Imagine a bonnet drawing in men. You see a woman wearing a bonnet and you're like, I'm going to hit that later.
At 2:30 on the morning of August 31st, Mary's friend Emily Holland met her by the shop at the junction of Osborne Street and Whitechapel Road. Mary was incredibly intoxicated and boasted to Emily that she had made her lodging money 3 times over, but had spent it all already. Emily was concerned with her drunken state and attempted to persuade Mary to come back to Wilmot's with her. Mary refused and told Emily that she would get the money somehow, and stumbled off along the dark Whitechapel Road. This would be the last time that Mary was seen alive. Just an hour and 15 minutes later, the body of a woman was found lying between a gateway to Bucks Row, just off Whitechapel Road, about a 10-minute walk from the corner Mary and Emily had spoken at. Her throat had been cut back to the spine, and the wound had been so savagely inflicted that, according to some newspaper reports, it was nearly completely severed. Within 45 minutes, she was placed on a police ambulance, which was really not much more than a wooden hand cart, and taken to the mortuary in the nearby Chapel Workhouse Infirmary. It was here that Inspector Spratling of the Metropolitan Police's J Division arrived to take the description of the unknown, at the time, victim, and that was when he made the horrific discovery that, in addition to the throat wound, a deep laceration ran all the way from her abdomen, and she had been disemboweled. Later that day, she was identified as Mary Ann Nichols, and her father, Edward Walker, was tracked down and brought to the mortuary to formally identify the body of the Bucks Row victim. With him was Mary's eldest son, also named Edward, who recognized her as his mother. An hour later, her estranged husband, William Nichols, arrived to view her body. He seemed genuinely distressed by the sight and shook his head in disbelief and whispered to her, "I forgive you, as you are, what you have been to me." One newspaper said that as he emerged from the mortuary, ashen-faced, he sighed and said, "Well, there is no mistake about it. It has come to a sad end at last." The funeral of Mary Ann Nichols took place under a shroud of secrecy in order to deter any morbid funeral goers on Thursday, September 6th, 1888. The South Wales...
Which, let's just mention that that's today's date.
Yeah. It was not lost on me when I was writing this, that this was very timely.
Right.
The South Wales Echo published a story about it the following day. The time at which the cortege was to start was kept secret, and a ruse was resorted to in order to get the body out of the mortuary, where it has lain since the day of the murder. A pair-horse closed hearse was observed making its way down Hanbury Street, and the crowds, which numbered some thousands, made way for it to go along Old Montague Street, but instead of doing so, it passed on into Whitechapel Road, and doubling back, it reached the mortuary by the back gate, which is situated in Chapman's Court. No person was near other than the undertaker and his men when the coffin, which bore a plate with the inscription, "Mary Ann Nichols, aged 42, died August 31, 1888, was removed to the hearse and driven off to Hanbury Street, there to await the mourners. Meantime, the news had spread that the body in the hearse, and people flocked round to see the coffin. At length, the cortege started towards Ilford. The mourners were Mr. Edward Walker, the father of the deceased, and his grandson, together with two of the deceased's children. The procession proceeded along Baker's Row and past the corner of Bucks Row into the main road, where policemen were stationed every few yards. The houses in the neighborhood had the blinds drawn, and much sympathy was expressed for the relatives. They don't write things like this anymore about funerals or anything. Like, they used to put, like, in the newspaper how people died.
Right.
In detail. And they just don't do that anymore.
And I fear that, really and honestly, it's nobody's business.
That's true, but I'm nosy.
I started to say, I do be reading stuff hoping to get a hint. But...
Right. Because don't think I'm not looking into it.
Right.
The ruse that was created in order to get Mary Nichols' body to the undertaker could be said to have included an element of precognition. Her body was brought out of the back gate of the mortuary in Chapman's Court, and from there it was taken to the undertaker on Hanbury Street. 2 days later, the murderer struck again, murdering Annie Chapman on Hanbury Street.
Hamburger.
I almost said hamburger.
Annie Chapman, nicknamed Dark Annie, was also on a similar downward spiral as Mary Nichols. She had left behind her husband, John Chapman, and her children several years previously. John would periodically send her allowances until he died in 1886, and thereafter Annie supported herself by selling her own crochet work, as well as matches and flowers, and would supplement her income with casual prostitution. By September of 1888, she had been living off and on at Crossingham's lodging house on Dorset Street in Spitalfields. That's what I'm going to say that says.
That's yeah. that's how I took it.
She seemed to have had a cordial relationship with the other tenants, and Timothy Donovan, the deputy keeper, recalled her being an inoffensive soul whose primary weakness was her fondness for a drink. Following a fight with another resident at the lodging house during the last week of August, Annie sported a blackened eye and had been bruised on her chest and head and was in a considerable amount of pain. Friday, September 7th, around 5 p.m., Annie met with her friend Amelia Palmer on Dorset Street. Annie was said to have appeared unwell and complained of feeling too ill to do anything. 10 minutes later, Amelia met with Annie again, but by then, Annie was trying desperately to rally her spirits. It's no use giving way. I must pull myself together and get some money or I shall have no lodgings. Those were the last words Amelia Palmer heard Annie Chapman say. At 11:30 p.m. that night, Annie found herself at Crossingham's lodging house and asked Timothy Donovan if she could sit in the kitchen. He hadn't seen her for a few days and asked where she had been. In the infirmary, she told him with a weak voice. Timothy allowed her to go into the kitchen, and she remained there until the early morning hours of Saturday, September 8th. At 1:45 a.m., Donovan sent John Evans, the night watchman of the lodging house, to collect 4 pence from her for her bed. He found her, slightly tipsy and eating potatoes in the kitchen. When he requested the money from her, she wearily replied, "I haven't got it. I'm weak and ill, and I've been in the infirmary." She then went to Donovan's office and implored him to allow her to stay for a little bit longer. He told her that if she couldn't pay, she couldn't stay. Annie turned to leave, but turned back and told him to save a bed for her, adding, "I shall not be long before I'm in. I shall soon be back. Don't let the bed." She was escorted from the property by John Evans, and he watched her walk off along Dorset Street. He later observed that she appeared to be only slightly tipsy rather than completely drunk. At 5:30 a.m., Elizabeth Long spotted Annie talking with a man outside of number 29 and Hanbury Street, but not clocking anything suspicious about the couple. She continued on her way and didn't take much more notice than them. Just 30 minutes later, at 6 a.m., John Davis, an elderly resident of number 29, came downstairs and walked along the narrow passageway and opened the back door. The sight before him sent him reeling back, horrified. Moments later, 2 workmen were walking along Hanbury Street and were startled when, from the open door of number 29, a wild-eyed man came stumbling into the street. "Men, come here," he cried out. The pair nervously followed him down the passageway and looked into the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, where they saw the mutilated body of a woman lying on the ground between the steps and the wooden fence. Her head was turned toward the house, and her clothes had been tugged above her weight, which exposed her red and white striped stockings. A handkerchief was tied around her throat. It has been asserted that the killer tied this to stop the head from rolling away. However, that is false, and she had been wearing that before the killer cut her throat. Her face and hands were covered in blood, and her hands were raised and bent with the palms toward the upper portion of her body, which gave James Kent the impression that she'd been struggling against the attack for her throat. The 3 men stood in stunned silence for a few moments before they sprang into action. They raced out of the house and set off in different directions to find a policeman. The reality of what they had witnessed began to sink in for James Kent, and he abandoned the search to instead go have a brandy to settle his nerves. Henry Holland raced to Commercial Street and headed to the Spitalfields Market, where he found a constable on fixed point duty. With panted breath, Holland informed the officer of their discovery, and taken aback, the constable curtly informed him that it was against procedure for him to leave his post. Holland was angered by this attitude and later made an official complaint to the Commercial Street Police Station and was told that the officer was correct to follow procedure.
That's so messed up. That's so messed up.
Meanwhile, John Davis headed to the Commercial Street Police Station, bursting through the doors and breathlessly demanded to see a senior officer. Just moments later, Inspector Joseph Chandler hurried his way along Commercial Street, turning along Hanbury Street, and forcing his way through the gathering crowd of spectators in the passageway of number 29. Inspector Chandler ordered that the vicinity be cleared of all sightseers and that he sent a constable back to Commercial Street Police Station with instructions to bring back as many reinforcements as possible for crowd control. He dispatched another officer to fetch Dr. George Baxter Phillips, the divisional police surgeon. The inspector gathered some sacking fabric from a neighbor in order to cover the body until the police surgeon could arrive. Dr. Phillips arrived around 6:30 a.m., and the crowd outside the house had swelled to several hundred people. He cast a cursory glance down at the body, and it was blatantly obvious that she was beyond the need for any medical assistance. There was little more that Dr. Phillips could do for the woman at the scene, and he had pronounced her dead and ordered for her to be removed to the Whitechapel Workhouse Infirmary in Eagle Street off of Old Montague Street. As an agitated crowd watched, a battered coffin was carried from the building and placed on the police ambulance and set off eastward toward Brick Lane. Arriving at the mortuary gates a little before 7 a.m. were Robert Mann, who had previously stripped and washed the body of Mary Nichols without police authorization, waited to receive the body. Inspector Chandler arrived moments later and took a look at Mann and made it clear that no one was to touch the corpse until Dr. Phillips completed his post-mortem examination. Satisfied that the instructions were understood, Inspector Chandler left P.C. Barnes in charge and headed back to the police station. He and Dr. Phillips discovered later that within 2 hours of his departure, 2 nurses had said they were acting on the directions of the clerk of the workhouse guardians, had again stripped and washed the body before the post-mortem could be completed. Besides the other injuries noted, the post-mortem revealed that Annie Chapman's womb had not only been removed, it was taken by the killer. Like Mary Nichols, the funeral of Annie Chapman was carried out in secrecy on the morning of Friday, September 14th, 1888. The portion of Manor Park Cemetery where she was buried has been reused many times since then, and her exact resting place is unknown, and in recent years the graves have been cleared away and the area is being redeveloped. There is a small plaque by a grassy mound that indicates the interment of Annie Chapman. The legacy created by the horrific and brutal murder of Annie Chapman was that through the newspapers and the public at large, people began to pay attention to the plight of the poor women of the social class Annie came from. It had not gone unnoticed that just like Mary Nichols, Annie Chapman had died for the sake of not having 4 pence that would have paid for a place to sleep. The Daily Telegraph emphasized this by saying, "Dark Annie's spirit still walks Whitechapel, unavenged by justice. Dreadful end has compelled 100,000 Londoners to reflect what it must be like to have no home at all except the common kitchen of a low lodging house, to sit there sick and weak, bruised and wretched, for all lack of 4 pence with which to pay for the right of a doss, to be turned out after midnight to earn the requisite pence anywhere and anyhow, and in the course of earning it to come across your murderer and to caress your assassin."
Elizabeth Stride was born in Sweden on November 27, 1842. In 1886, she immigrated to England and arrived on the 7th of February to London. On March 7, 1869, she married John Thomas Stride at the Church of St. Giles in the Field in Holborn, and the newlyweds moved to the east of London, where they opened a coffee shop in Crisp Street, Poplar. The marriage fell apart by 1877, and Elizabeth began residing in various common lodging houses and became involved with a man named Michael Kidney. Much like the previous 2 victims, Elizabeth had a substance abuse problem and began to drink heavily, making numerous appearances before magistrates on charges of being drunk and disorderly. For the last 6 years of her life, she resided off and on at a common lodging house at 32 Flower and Dean Street in Spitalfields. She had been gone for some time, but returned to the lodging house on the Tuesday before her death. On Saturday, September 29, 1888, Elizabeth had spent the afternoon cleaning 2 rooms at the lodging house, and was paid 6 pence by the deputy keeper. By 6:30 p.m., she was having a drink in the Queen's Head pub and at the junction of Fashion Street and Commercial Street, which the pub still exists, by the way. She returned to the lodging house and got dressed for a night out. She left the house again at 7:30, and there were several sightings of her over the course of the next 5 hours, and by midnight she had found her way to Berner Street off Commercial Road. It heavily rained that night, and the next sighting of her was at 11, when Jay Best and John Gardner were certain they spotted her sheltering in a doorway of the Bricklayer's Arms on Settle Street, and they said she was accompanied by a man who was about 5'5". They said he had a black mustache, sandy eyelashes, whatever that means, and was wearing a black morning suit paired with a billycock hat.
I would venture to say that means like light eyelashes like mine.
Yeah, but how are they seeing that from?
I don't know. I'm just
in the dark and in the rain.
But a black mustache. So I would assume that if he's got sandy eyelashes, that he would probably be like a redhead.
Maybe, yeah.
But a black mustache?
Yeah. Maybe it's a fake one. Best said they did not appear willing to go out. He was hugging and kissing her, and as he seemed a respectably dressed man, we were rather astonished at the way he was going on with the woman. The two men lightheartedly bantered at the couple's expense and remarked, "Watch out, that's Leather Apron getting round you." Seemingly embarrassed by the pronouncement, the couple went off like a shot, and Best and Gardner watched them scurry through the rain toward Commercial Road. At about 11:45, William Marshall, a laborer who lived at number 64 Berner Street, was standing outside his lodgings when he noticed a man and woman outside number 63. He said they both seemed sober enough and watched as they began to kiss. Marshall heard the man remark to the woman, "You should say anything but your prayers." He said the couple then moved off and headed toward the direction of Dutfield's yard. He described the man as being about middle-aged and stout, and he appeared to be a clerk. He was about 5'6", clean-shaven, and well-dressed. He wore a small black cutaway coat, dark trousers, and a round cap with a small sailor-like peak.
This bitch getting around.
Number 40 Berner Street was the International Working Men's Educational Club, founded in 1884 by a group of Jewish socialists, and member Morris Eagle had left the club around 12:15 a.m. to walk his young lady home. He returned to the club 25 minutes till 1 and found the front door locked, and went through the gates into Dutfield's yard and entered the club via its back door. When he passed through the gates, he said there wasn't anything on the ground that he had noticed, and wasn't sure that he would have noticed if a man and woman had been in the yard at the time. Since it was pitch black outside, he was not able to say for certain whether the body of Elizabeth Stride could have been there at the time. At 12:30 a.m., PC William Smith proceeded along Berner Street on his patrol and noticed a man and woman on the opposite side of the road to Dutfield's yard. He noticed that the man was approximately 28 years old, with a dark complexion and a small dark mustache. He was about 5'7", wore a dark overcoat, a hard felt deerstalker, and dark clothing. The woman was later identified as Elizabeth Stride, and he noted that she had a flower pinned to her jacket. Since the couple were not doing anything to arouse P.C. Smith's suspicions, he continued on his way onto Commercial Road. At about 12:45 on September 30th, Israel Schwartz witnessed her being attacked by a man in a gateway off Berner Street known as Dutfield's yard. But rather than doing anything about it, Schwartz assumed that he was witnessing a domestic argument and crossed the road to avoid the quarrel. It is highly likely that he saw Elizabeth in the beginning stages of the attack that would result in her murder. At 1 a.m., Louis Daimschutz, the steward of a club that sided onto Dutfield's yard, came down Berner Street with his pony and costermonger's barrow and turned into the open gates of Dutfield's yard. As soon as he did so, the pony shied and pulled left. Lewis looked into the darkness and saw a dark form on the ground. He attempted to lift the object with his whip, but wasn't able to, and so he jumped down and struck a match, and it was a wet and windy night, and the match flickered for only a second. But it was just enough time for Lewis to see that it was the body of a woman lying on the ground. For some reason, he immediately assumed it might be his wife, and that she was drunk, and so he went into the club to get help lifting her up. But he found his wife in the kitchen, and so he took a candle, and he and several others went into the yard, and by candlelight discovered a pool of blood gathering beneath the woman. It was noted that the woman's throat had been cut. Oh wait, they sent for police, and a doctor was summoned, who pronounced the woman dead. It was noted that the woman's throat had been cut, but the rest of her body had not been mutilated like the other victims had. And this led police to assuming that Lewis had interrupted the killer when he turned into Dutfield's yard. The body was moved to the nearest mortuary in the nearby churchyard of the St. George in the East, and it was here that she was identified as Elizabeth Stride. Elizabeth Stride was laid to rest in the East London Cemetery on Saturday, October 6, 1888, and her interment was given very little attention by the press. The Beverly and East Riding Recorder said that her burial took place in the quietest possible manner and at the expense of the parish. On the night of her burial, though, a woman went to the police station in Cardiff to complain that she had spoken with the spirit of Elizabeth Stride during a seance and that the victim identified her killer. The revelations were reported by the Somerset County Gazette the following week. An extraordinary statement bearing upon the Whitechapel tragedies was made to the Cardiff police on Saturday by a respectable-looking elderly woman who stated that she was a spiritualist and, in company with 5 other persons, held a seance on Saturday night. They summoned the spirit of Elizabeth Stride, and after some delay, the spirit came, and in answer to questions stated that the murderer was a middle-aged man whose name she mentioned, and who resided at a given number in Commercial Road or Street, Whitechapel, and who belonged to a gang of 12.
See, but what the thing about, like, the seance thing, that was very much so, like, around that time.
In 1888, it was like...
That was, like, the rich social thing to do.
Yeah.
You gathered around and held seances.
Right.
And I think that even continued on in, like, the early 19s.
Oh, yeah, for sure. For sure. All right, hold on.
I feel like I have a burp that's, like, settled in right here that I just cannot get out. Chances are it's going to come out as a fart later. Okay. Pray for Brittany.
Thank you.
Catherine, I'm going to say
Eddowes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Was born in Wolverhampton. Oh, hold on.
Wolverhampton.
Wolverhampton.
The H is silent.
On April 14th, 1842, but her family moved to London when she was a young girl. By her mid-teens, both of her parents had died, and she and her siblings were separated. Catherine returned to Wolverhampton to live with an aunt. She later met former soldier Thomas Conway and thought it was claimed that the two were married. And though it was claimed that the two were married, there is no records of this marriage in existence. She did have his initials TC tattooed in blue on her arm. The two had 3 children together and earned a small income by selling chapbooks, which were cheap books sold by peddlers on the street. In the late 1870s, saw the couple move to London, and they were living in Westminster.
Minster.
Whatever. Catherine, as the previous victims, had begun drinking heavily, and her alcoholism and fiery temperament resulted in their relationship becoming extremely tempestuous. I'm struggling. And the couple were on and off again repeatedly. According to one of Catherine's sisters, Conway was abusive, and Catherine often sported blackened eyes from the episodes of domestic violence. So there's a pattern here.
Yes.
Women weren't thought of as shit.
No.
It's never the man's fault.
And it gets worse from here.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
By 1880, the couple had split up for good, and Catherine gravitated to the East End of London, and here she moved into Cooney's Common Lodge and House at 55 Flower and Dean Street. And it was here in 1881 she met a man named John Kelly who earned his living as a casual laborer at the local markets. The couple lived together as man and wife at the lodging house until Catherine's death in 1888. The deputy lodging house keeper, Frederick Wilkinson, later remarked that she was a very jolly woman who was often singing. During the summer, Catherine and Kelly would go to Kent to go hop picking, which was a popular way for East Enders during that time to enjoy a break from the stifling and overcrowded streets of the district, and it provided an opportunity to earn a little ready cash. In September of 1888, they set off for their annual hop picking break, but the hop yield was disappointingly low that year due to the unusually wet summer, and the work was limited, so they decided to return to London. So like hops for like beer.
I think so,
Okay.
yeah.
They arrived back in the capital on the afternoon of Friday, September 28th. Kelly earned 6 pence that day, and Catherine, taking 2 pence for herself, gave him 4 pence and told him to use it for a bed at Cooney's that night. She said she would get a bed in the casual ward of the Shoe Lane workhouse. She did get a bed, but there was some trouble at the workhouse, and she was asked to leave. She turned up at Cooney's on Saturday morning at 8 a.m., and the couple went to pawn Kelly's boots at a pawnbroker's shop on Church Street, and they used the money to buy breakfast. That afternoon, Catherine told Kelly that she was going to try to borrow some money from her daughter in Bermondsey, and at 2 p.m., the pair parted. Kelly later testified that he warned her about the Whitechapel murderer, and Catherine brushed his fears aside, saying, "Don't you fear for me. I'll take care of myself, and I shan't fall into his hands." There is no record of how she spent her afternoon, but she definitely didn't visit her daughter. She did get money from somewhere, though, evidenced by her arrest for drunkenness at 8 p.m. on Aldgate High Street, by Police Constable Robinson in the City of London Police. She was escorted to Bishopsgate Police Station, where she was promptly locked in a cell to sober up, and she fell asleep almost immediately. By midnight, she was awake and seemed decently sober enough to be released by the city's jailer, right?
I think so, yeah.
PC George Hutt. Before she left, she told him that her name was Mary Ann Kelly, and gave her address as 6 Fashion Street. Hutt escorted her to the door of the police station and told her to close it on her way out. "All right, good night, old cock," was her reply as she stepped out into the early morning.
I love that for her.
Right. At 1:35 a.m., 3 men, Joseph Lewind, Joseph Hyam Levy, and Harry Harris, what an unfortunate name, witnessed her talking with a man at the church passage entrance into Mitre Street, located on the eastern fringe of the City of London. At 1:44 a.m., P.C. Watkins turned out of the Leadenhall Street and strolled along Mitre Street. He nearly instantaneously saw something that set him staggering back in shock. Lying on her back in a pool of blood with her clothes thrown up over her waist was another female victim. P.C. Watkins raced across the square and burst into Curly and Tong's warehouse, where he knew a retired police officer, George Morris, was working as the night watchman. "For God's sake, mate, come to my assistance. Here's another woman cut to pieces." The night watchman paused to grab a lamp and followed P.C. Watkins to the southwest corner of the square and took one look at the remains and ran off along Mitre Street toward Aldgate and became to furiously blow his whistle as he ran. He met with P.C. James Harvey and P.C. Holland in Aldgate and brought them back to the square. Holland immediately left to go get Dr. George Williams Secura from his home on Jewry Street. The doctor arrived at the scene at about 1:55 a.m., and at the inquest later, he said that the place where the murder had occurred was the darkest part of Mitre Street, but there must have been just enough light for the killer to carry out his horrific crime. The doctor said that the death would have been instantaneous once the murderer cut the windpipe and blood vessels. Most significantly, he was of the opinion that the murderer possessed no great anatomical skill and more or less possessed only a basic knowledge of anatomy. When asked by the coroner if he would have anticipated the murderer would be covered in blood, he replied, not necessarily. At the scene, Dr. Secura did little more than pronounce the woman deceased and decided to not touch the body, and instead preferred to wait for the arrival of the City Police Divisional Surgeon, Dr. Frederick Gordon Brown. Meanwhile, police began arriving to the Mitre Square from all over the city, and Inspector Edward Collard arrived from Bishopsgate Police Station and ordered a search of the neighborhood and instructed officers to go door-to-door to do door-to-door inquiries in the area around Mitre Square. The next to arrive was Superintendent James McWilliam, the head of the city police detective department, who arrived with a number of detectives in tow, all of whom he promptly sent off to make a thorough search of the Spitalfields streets and lodging houses. Several men were stopped and questioned as officers ran off in different directions, but it was all for naught because the killer had seemingly melted into the dark of the night and vanished. It is possible that he escaped via the adjacent St. James Place where there was a metropolitan fire escape station, but the firemen on duty said that they did not see or hear anything. City Police Constable Richard Pierce, who lived at number 3 Mitre Square and his bedroom overlooked the site of the murder, also said that he didn't see anything either. The night watchman George Morris, who had blown the whistle that first alerted police to the atrocity that had occurred, expressed that he was totally baffled as to how a crime so brutal could have been committed nearby without him hearing a single sound. The Illustrated Police News reported he could hear the footsteps of the policeman as he passed on his beat every quarter of an hour, so that it appeared impossible that the woman could have uttered any sound without his detecting it. It was only on the night that he remarked to some policemen that he wished the butcher would have come round Mitre Square and he would give him a doing. Yet the butcher had come and he was perfectly ignorant of it. Weirdly, at that exact moment that Catherine Eddowes was going into Mitre Square with her killer, 3 city detectives, Daniel Halse, Robert Outram, and Edward Marriott, were orchestrating plainclothes officers to patrol the city's eastern area. Apparently, though, the murderer managed to move undetected and was able to head back into the streets of the East End. Halse was by St. Baldulph's Church when he learned of the murder just before 2 a.m., and he hurried to Mitre Square, giving instructions to the constables present to search the neighborhood. Halse set off to do his own search and first headed for Middlesex Street and turned into Wentworth Street, where he stopped to question 2 men. Both of the men were able to provide him with a satisfactory account of their night, and he allowed them to continue on their way. He passed through Golston Street around 2:20 a.m., where he noticed nothing out of place, and then headed back to Mitre Square, and here he found that the body had been removed to the Golden Lane mortuary. As the previous victims, Catherine's throat had been cut and she had been disemboweled. In addition to these injuries were deep lacerations to her face, particularly her cheeks and eyelids. The killer removed and took her uterus and left kidney. The funeral of Catherine Eddowes took place on Monday, October 8th, with dense crowds gathered around the mortuary in Golden Lane. Thousands of onlookers lined the street that the funeral carriage was to pass through. Meanwhile, there were more than 500 people waiting at the City of London cemetery where her burial was to take place. The cemetery has maintained a small plaque in her honor since the 1990s, and people come here to leave flowers and coins, as this is the closest it is possible to be to the final resting place of Catherine Eddowes. So,
Isn't
like,
it crazy to think about the fact that, like, she was just some lady, and because she was murdered, there were thousands of people at her funeral?
that is crazy. It's also crazy
It's also
to me.
crazy that, like, the only reason for that is because there was, like, no social media or anything.
Right, well.
They didn't have anything else going on.
It's crazy to me that that these police officers had to have actually, like, they talked to this dude.
Oh, yeah.
They interviewed this dude.
We'll definitely, like, get to that a little bit.
Oh, my mic moved again, but I figured it out.
What?
It's you pulling the cord.
Oh, that makes sense. The final and most enigmatic of the Ripper's victims was Mary Jane Kelly, and she is also the victim that we know the least about. There are almost no records of her life prior to her arrival in the East End of London, and what is known is only based on what she revealed to the people that knew her. We don't really even know if Mary Kelly was her real name. Based on the fact that there are no records of her prior to her time in the area, I would say that it is highly likely that that was not her real name, and unfortunately we will never know who she actually was. What you got going on over there? That looks gross.
I know, I actually peeled it this time.
Her boyfriend, Joseph Barnett, that she resided with until right before her death, said that she told him that she was born in Limerick, Ireland, and that her father's name was John Kelly. He said that she told him she had 6 or 7 brothers and 1 sister. Her family moved to Wales when she was a young girl, and when she turned 16, she met and married a collier named Davis or Davies. Just 3 years into their marriage, when she was 19, her husband was killed in a mine explosion, and she moved to Cardiff to live with a female cousin who introduced her to prostitution. Mary moved to London around 1884 and made the acquaintance of a French woman that ran a high-class brothel in Knightsbridge, an establishment that Mary began working at.
Okay, so I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
At what point in history did it become taboo for women to do this shit?
I think it was always kind of taboo because they were looked down, like higher society looked down on them because, you know, and like particularly, and this is in the Victorian era, so like it's, you know, the high collars,
yeah,
and modestly dressing and that kind of thing. So I don't think it was like, that's why they were in the East End of London and didn't have any money, and, you know. Let's see. She told Barnett that during this time of her life, she was dressed well and had been driven around in a carriage and for a time led the life of a lady. She told him that she had made several trips to France during this time and had accompanied a gentleman to Paris, but she didn't like it there and returned to London after just 2 weeks. From that time on, she began using a continental version of her name and would refer to herself as Marie Jeanette Kelly. After that, her life went on a downward spiral that saw her move to the East End of London, where she became a lodger of a Mrs. Bukey in a side thoroughfare off Ratcliffe Highway. Not long after she arrived, she enlisted her landlady's assistance in returning to the West End to retrieve a box which contained dresses of a costly description from the Frenchwoman. By now, Mary had begun to drink heavily, and this would lead to conflict between her and Mrs. Bukey, with relations becoming so strained between them that Mary moved out and went to lodge at the home of Mrs. Mary McCarthy at 1 Breezer's Hill, Pennington Street, St. George in the East. By 1886, she had moved to Cooley's Common Lodging House on Thrall Street and was living here on Good Friday, April 6th, 1887, when she met Joseph Barnett, who worked as a porter at Billingsgate Fish Market. Amara, get a grip. Before long, The two were living together, and by 1888 they were renting a small room at 13 Miller's Court from John McCarthy, who owned the Chandler's shop on Dorset Street. After her death, the Daily Telegraph published an article and described her as having been of fair complexion with light hair, and she possessed rather attractive features. Anyone who knew Mary during this time of her life seemed to have been fond of her, and one acquaintance said that she was an excellent scholar and an artist of no mean degree. Her friend Maria Harvey described her as much superior to most persons in her position of life. In her position in life. Retired police officer Walter Dew wrote in his 1937 memoir that he knew her quite well by sight, and he said he would often see her parading along Commercial Street between Flower and Dean Street and Aldgate, or along Whitechapel Road. She was usually in the company of 2 or 3 of her kind, fairly neatly dressed and invariably wearing a clean white apron but no hat. Her landlord, John McCarthy, said her only fault was that once she was drinking, she could be very noisy, but otherwise she was a very quiet woman.
Same.
She and Barnett seemed to live happily together until he lost his job at the market in mid-1888, and she returned to prostitution, which sparked arguments between the two, and during one heated exchange, a pane in the window by the door of their room was broken. This is important. Okay. The precariousness of their finances resulted in their falling behind on the rent, and by early November, the landlord was owed 29 shillings in rent arrears. On October 30th, 1888, Joseph Barnett moved out, but they remained on friendly terms, and he would drop by to see her occasionally. The last time he was around, 7:30. The last time was around 7:30 on the evening of Thursday, November 8th, and he did not stay for very long. Over the next 14 hours, several people claimed to have seen her, one being George Hutchinson, an unemployed laborer who had met her on Commercial Street at 2 a.m. on November 9th. She asked him if he would lend her 6 pence, and he said he couldn't as he had already spent all of his money. She told him she needed to go find some money and continued up Commercial Street, where a man coming from the opposite direction tapped her on the shoulder and said something to her, and then they both began to laugh. The man put his arm around Mary, and the two started walking back along Commercial Street, passing by Hutchinson, who was standing under the lamp by the Queen's Head pub at the junction of Fashion Street and Commercial Street. Even though the man had his head down and had pulled his hat down over his eyes, Hutchinson said he stooped down and looked him in the face, and the man gave him what he would later describe as a stern look. Hutchinson said he followed the two as they crossed into Dorset Street and watched them turn into Miller's Court. He waited outside the court for 45 minutes, but they never reemerged, and so he left. At around 4 a.m., 2 of Mary's neighbors heard a faint cry of murder, but because these were common cries in the area, often the result of a drunken brawl, the two ignored it. At 10:45 the next morning, or the morning of November 9th, her landlord, John McCarthy, sent his assistant, Thomas Boyer, over to Mary's room to try to collect some rent from her. With determination, Boyer marched into Miller's Court and banged on the door of her room, but received no reply. When he tried to open the door, he found it locked. He walked to the broken window pane and reached in, pushing aside the muslin curtain, and peered into the gloomy room. Moments later, with an ashen face, Boyer burst back into McCarthy's shop in Dorset Street. Governor, that's how it was spelled in the article. I knocked at the door and could not make anyone answer. I looked through the window and saw a lot of blood. McCarthy replied, "Good God, you don't mean that," and the two raced back into Miller's Court, where McCarthy stooped down to look through the broken glass as Boyer had. He would later recall the horror scene that greeted him. The sight we saw I cannot drive away from my mind. It looked more the work of the devil than of a man. I had heard a great deal about the Whitechapel murders, but I declare to God I had never expected to see such a sight as this. The whole scene is more than I can describe. I hope I may never see such a sight as this again. The police were immediately sent for, and one of the first officers on the scene was Walter Dew, who would later recall the horror of what he saw through the broken window pane. On the bed was all that remained of the young woman. There was little left of her, not much more than a skeleton. Her face was terribly scarred and mutilated. All this was horrifying enough, but the mental picture of that sight which remains most vividly with me is the poor woman's eyes. They were wide open and seemed to be staring straight at me with a look of terror. News of another murder spread around the neighborhood, and crowds of people converged at both ends of Dorset Street, with police constables struggling to keep them at bay. More detectives and doctors arrived to Miller's Court, but police delayed entering the room, believing that they had been ordered to wait for bloodhounds to be brought to the scene and put on the scent of the killer. Just before 1:30 p.m., they received word that the order for the bloodhounds had been countermanded, and they requested that John McCarthy force open the door, which he did with a pickaxe. The sight and scent of that room on that afternoon, as the officers filed into the small room, was something that would haunt many of them for years to come, and the horror of the experience was succinctly expressed by one of the doctors in attendance, who later told a journalist that he had witnessed a great deal in dissecting rooms, but he had never witnessed such a horrible sight as what he saw in 13 Miller's Court. The police and doctors spent the next several hours carrying out a detailed inspection of the crime scene. They also brought in a photographer, and the body of Mary Kelly was photographed, and this horrific and haunting image can easily be found online, but we will personally not be sharing it. This photo does stand as one of the earliest examples of crime scene photos in human history. Just before 4 p.m. on Saturday afternoon, a horse and cart arrived on the opposite side of Dorset Street from Miller's Court, where a large number of residents and neighboring properties had gathered to see the remains of Mary Kelly being brought out in a battered coffin, scarred from constant use. The coffin was placed on the cart and was taken to the mortuary in the churchyard of St. Leonard's Church in Shoreditch. Once the body was removed, the windows of 13 Miller's Court were boarded up and the door was padlocked shut. Neighbors were left to come to terms with the horror that had occurred right in their midst, and few of them could have slept soundly in their beds that night. It's bad.
That's
like as somebody who likes photography history, like I'm already familiar with the case. Yeah. I didn't even. Yeah.
Is the most terrifying, gruesome thing I think I've ever. Listen, horror movies today could never.
No.
If you don't have a weak constitution, if this is a thing that you can handle,
yeah,
do with that.
From a historical aspect, I think it is a very important photo. Just in terms of crime scene photography. Because back then forensics was not a thing.
Yeah.
Really. So their thought to even have that photographed was remarkable in many ways.
Oh, my word.
But word got out that the funeral of Mary Kelly would be taking place on Monday, November 19th, and from a very early hour, crowds began to congregate around St. Leonard's Church, where the body had remained in the neighboring mortuary since the day of the body's discovery. At noon, the church bell tolled, and at 12:30 p.m., the coffin of polished elm and oak with 2 crowns of artificial flowers and a floral cross placed on top was carried out on the shoulders of 4 men. The crowd, which by this time had swelled to several thousand, was affected by the sight, and they surged forward to attempt to touch the coffin and read the simple inscription that read, Marie Jeanette Kelly, died 9th November 1888, aged 25 years. A large contingent of police desperately fought to hold the crowd back as the coffin was placed on an open car, drawn by 2 horses, and the procession included a mourning coach, one of which held Joseph Barnett, and set off for St. Patrick's Roman Catholic Cemetery in Leytonstone. The way there was lined with a dense crowd, and the police constables leading the escort struggled to clear a path for the procession as it made slow progress toward the cemetery, where 100 or so onlookers were already waiting when it arrived just before 2 p.m. The mourners were the only ones allowed into the cemetery, and there a parish priest met them by the small chapel, and then preceded by 2 acolytes and a cross-bearer, he led the way to the northeast corner of the burial ground where Mary Kelly was laid to rest. Nobody knew at the time that in the bloody carnage of that tiny room in Miller's Court, the autumn of terror had reached its bitter end. The days and weeks that followed saw the district return to some sense of normalcy. There were other murders that were included in the Whitechapel murders file, but the general consensus now is that these were not carried out by the same killer as the 5 women. The legacy of those crimes did focus attention to the plight of the poor who lived in the area that would later be called the Abyss. But whether or not it actually helped to bring about change to the horrible social conditions is debatable. Today, people come from all around the world to pay respect to the memory of Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. There can be no doubt that their names may have long been forgotten, if not for the fact that they were murdered by a man whose name we will never actually know.
So who was Jack the Ripper? The number of suspects now runs well over 100, and some of them are highly possible contenders, while others are improbable at best. Every year, several books come out claiming that the authors have managed to crack this more than a century-old cold case. Some have managed to uncover new small nuggets of information, but in doing so, they really just add another extra piece to an already gargantuan jigsaw puzzle. The majority, however, bend the facts to fit their narrative as opposed to looking at the theory and demonstrating how it stands up against the well-known facts of the case. In the early days of this case, the police appear to have suspected that the crimes were being carried out by one of the local gangs, and so their investigations focused more heavily on these high-rep gangs, but by early September of 1888, the police had concluded that if they were responsible, the publicity and panic that the murders had caused would have led to someone affiliated with the gangs informing on the others. When Annie Chapman was murdered on September 8th, the police seemed to decide that the culprit was just one lone assassin, and they began to look for ways to bring him to justice.
There was much speculation that the killer possessed some level of anatomical knowledge, and so much so that the police began to look into the activities of several medical students who had spent some time in asylums. But this line of inquiry only led to dead ends, and the movements of the students were ruled out for any involvement in the crimes. Others disagreed that the killer possessed surgical precision and was instead demonstrating the abilities of a butcher or a slaughterman. The police also carried out extensive inquiries among the local butchers and the slaughterhouses, but yet again, these investigations all led to dead ends, as all of the alibis checked out. During the hunt for Jack the Ripper, the police remained convinced that they were looking for someone who lived in the area, and overall, their inquiries and investigations focused on the neighborhood where the crimes occurred. Over 2,000 interviews were conducted by the Victorian police officers, and more than 300 people were actually investigated, and over 80 people were detained in police custody. It is entirely possible that they did speak to the actual murderer, but the investigations yielded nothing concrete enough to enable them to definitively proclaim one of them as the guilty party.
Since the Whitechapel murders ended, suspect after suspect has been put forward as being responsible for the crimes. Prince Albert Edward Victor, Lewis Carroll, the Freemasons, and Dr. Bernardo are some of the more outlandish people thrust into the list of suspects, but others such as Thomas Cutbush and Carl Feigenbaum were put forth and quickly discarded as likely suspects. Their names were snatched back on the list thanks to modern research or when their asylum records were open to the public. Other suspects on the list include a man that the prostitutes had nicknamed Leather Apron, Montague John Druitt, Michael Ostrug, Aaron Kaminsky, George Chapman, Francis Tumblety, James Maybrick, Walter Sickert, Charles Cross, Frederick Deeming, Louis Dimeschutz, Mrs. Piercy, and Niall Cream.
That's an unfortunate name.
Yeah.
As this episode is getting to be a little on the long side, I feel that it would be doing a disservice to cut off the information or give abbreviated information. And so I will instead prepare a second part of this episode that will come out after our Halloween episode. So in part 2, we will dive further into that list of suspects that could have likely committed the crimes, the forensics, the Ripper letters, the media frenzy, and the Ripper murders placed in popular culture. Even though the Ripper case has been done over and over again, it never ceases to be one of the OG mysteries of modern history and will remain so for the end of time,
right.
Really, because there's almost no physical evidence left. But we'll get into that in part 2. So it won't be next week, but it'll be the following week.
So here's my take.
Yes.
It ended with that last one.
Mm-hmm.
Because the previous ones just didn't.
I don't think. Yes,
it just didn't hit right.
Right.
He didn't get to finish the job.
The ability to have the privacy of the room
exactly
allowed him to really let out the debauchery that he had within him. Now, whether or not he was able to contain it for the rest of his life, maybe he died, maybe, something happened. And I think some of these suspects that we'll get into in the next part, it will kind of explain why, if it was them, why they stopped.
Well, and 2, I think,
or why they would have stopped.
One of the reasons they could have stopped was that maybe one of these women, being a prostitute vices, had a type of disease that because he came in contact with their blood, he could have contracted and it took him out.
Right. And maybe that's what sent him on, because we've seen that a lot with serial killers. Like they'll either, they contracted something from someone and it pissed them off, so they took it out on, any that they could get their hands on. So we've seen that before in history. So I don't know. We'll get into some of these suspects because I have one that I'm convinced it was, but I'm excited to kind of dig into some more of this list.
I always got to be sitting on top of an event. Now, here in a couple of months, I'm going to be like, hell yeah.
Right. But yeah.
I liked that. That was good. I can't wait for part 2.
Yeah. As even in part 2, also we'll get into movies, and because I know that one of my first introductions to the Jack the Ripper case was the film From Hell. So I'm excited to kind of dig into that aspect of it too, as to where the Jack the Ripper mythos falls in popular culture, as far as just as a story that scares people.
Right.
So let me open my nonprofit. Mental health, as you all know, is something that is near and dear to my heart. And as we approach the darker months of the year and seasonal depression is upon us, one of our resources here in Tennessee is called Tennessee Voices. And they offer a lot of services to all 95 counties to prevent crisis, heal trauma, and build long-term stability, including school-based and outpatient counseling for children and teens, peer and clinical support for adults addressing trauma, depression, and substance use. They have family-centered services, including caregiver therapy, parenting coaching, and early childhood home visiting, housing stabilization, and wraparound programs to keep families intact and prevent system involvement. They do advocacy and education to reduce the stigma around mental health and expand access and change policies that perpetuate inequity. They have their model is whole family, trauma informed, and community driven. And they stand by healing parents alongside their children, which provides critical resources like housing and mental health support, and advocating for systemic change. And Tennessee Voices helps families thrive and communities grow stronger. And if you feel inclined to donate to this organization, there will be a donate link in the episode description, and it will be on our socials as well.
That's a good one.
I really, really like this one. I looked at several, and I was like, this one stands out the best.
I like it.
All right. Well, we'll see you guys next week for our Halloween episode.
Make sure you're following us on the socials like Facebook,
Instagram,
TikTok,
YouTube.
And if you've got any ideas that you want us to talk about, or if you've got a story you want us to share, or just a story in general that you just want to tell us, because why the hell not? You can reach out to us at wandersofweird@gmail.com. Also, if you just feel like donating some money, just because you can, while you're donating to this nonprofit, you can donate.
My Venmo is at Schnitter.
We'll give you a Venmo. Just ask. We may need
to like one day set one up for the podcast
when we're ready to start making money, because
that's true.
That's stuff we got to report.
I think it would be easier to set up a PayPal account than a Venmo account.
Yeah, but that's stuff you got to report to the governments.
Yeah.
So we'll get there one day.
Mail us cash.
If you want to pay for us a trip to go ghost hunting at, holler at
email us the confirmation at wandersofweird@gmail.com.
All right, guys. Okay, bye.
Bye.